This episode is brought to you by Charles Schwab. Decisions made in Washington affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Washington Wise is an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab. This podcast unpacks the stories making news in Washington and how they may affect your finances and portfolio. Listen at schwab.com/WashingtonWise.
At the start of this month, millions of Americans faced a sort of rude awakening.
Well, now, after 3 odd years of a COVID-19 pandemic-era freeze, student loan borrowers are going to have to start repaying again.
Jeremy Bauer-Wolf is a reporter for Higher Ed Dive. It's his job to follow the tug-of-war over student loan debt in Washington. Student loan payments were originally paused under the Trump administration back in March 2020. But now, interest is accruing again, and it's time to pay up. Have you spoken to anyone who is suddenly faced with a skyrocketing bill?
Oh, absolutely. My own partner, he has graduate loans and is now facing a lot of different lifestyle changes just based on these student loans restarting.
What plans are they making to deal with the sudden financial hit?
Well, he was balancing a sort of a COVID-19 era rent, and that raised, and now he's dealing with a $100 extra bill every month. So we're working through, we're definitely going to be cutting down on that takeout. We're going to have to be potentially looking for new work. And it's a lot. And his story is echoed throughout the country. There are a lot of borrowers who are in even far worse financial straits than him.
People scrambling to come up with the money to pay off their debts might be wondering, wasn't the Biden administration supposed to fix this by now? Back in August of last year, President Biden announced a plan to cancel up to $430 billion in student loan debt. Critics immediately sued. And this June, the case went before the Supreme Court. Somewhat predictably, the conservative majority ruled no dice.
The court has struck down a Biden administration program that would have offered individual borrowers up to $20,000 of student loan forgiveness. They have found that Biden did not have the standing under a 2020 COVID-era law to give that sort of forgiveness. This obviously is going to have a huge impact on...
Now, Americans are left holding the bill. And with the cost of higher education at an all-time high, the Biden administration is trying to find another way to help borrowers out.
We see, a lot of the discourse say, well, you made your bed, lie in it. But a lot of times, student loans were a necessity for some folks who are trying to make it up the social mobility ladder.
President Biden has tried to tackle student loans in a lot of different ways at this point. Can he succeed at solving the problem without Congress, without the court?
I would say it would be challenging to do, right? The root cause of rising college, that does take really, I think, a wholesale revision to federal law and policy that, the executive wing just can't carry out on its own.
Today on the show, Americans are paying off their student loans again. What, if anything, can Biden do about it? I'm Mary C. Curtis, filling in for Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around.
This episode is brought to you by Charles Schwab. Decisions made in Washington affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Listen to Washington Wise, an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab, to hear the stories making news right now. Hosted by Mike Townsend, Charles Schwab's managing director for legislative and regulatory affairs, Washington Wise takes a nonpartisan look at the stories that matter most to investors. Tune in to learn about the policy initiatives for retirement savings, taxes, and trade. Hear about inflation fears, the Federal Reserve, and how regulatory developments can affect companies, sectors, and even the entire market. Mike and his guests offer their perspective on how policy changes could affect what you do with your portfolio. Download the latest episode and follow at schwab.com/WashingtonWise or wherever you're listening right now. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Most of you listening right now are probably multitasking. You are listening while you're driving, cleaning, exercising, maybe even grocery shopping. But if you're not in some kind of moving vehicle, there's something else you could be doing right now. Getting an auto quote from Progressive Insurance. It's really easy, and you can save money by doing it right now from your phone. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save nearly $750 on average. And auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Discounts for having multiple vehicles on your policy, being a homeowner, and more. So just like your favorite podcast, Progressive will be with you 24/7, 365 days a year. So you're protected, no matter what. Multitask right now. Quote your car insurance at Progressive.com to join over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations.
More than 43 million Americans hold some amount of federal student loan debt. And while most of them have less than 10 grand, others are carrying over $100,000 on their backs. Jeremy says things didn't used to be this way.
Government assistance programs many years ago used to cover, a majority of the cost of college. Now that's just no longer the case, right? So we're seeing these costs skyrocket, and we're seeing students try to, understand, well, my parents, they were able to do this. They were able to maybe take out loans, pay them back, or even, just pay their way through. And it's just an entirely different system that I don't know everybody has grasped yet.
For some, particularly for progressives, canceling student loan debt feels like a slam dunk political win. But I wonder if it really is. What does polling say?
Actually, there's a good chunk of Americans who were very much in favor of the student loan debt, and absent of some of the partisan discourse. Really across the board, I think even moderates are saying, this could help our economy in many ways. It's not always a clear slam dunk that, it's going to be a bipartisan initiative, but mostly folks want to see this kind of loan forgiveness.
I cover politics, and I don't remember Biden being exactly Mr. Student Loan Forgiveness on the campaign trail. That wasn't one of his big issues. What brought about his change of heart here?
I think it's a couple things. One, you did have the progressive wing of his party really vocal in saying cancel student debt, right? And folks were saying, we should cancel all loan debt. We should cancel up to $50,000 worth of debt. I don't think that was ever an option for the president. But you have, again, so this vocal wing of the party combined with the economic conditions of the COVID-19 pandemic.
How long has he been trying to curb student debt?
Well, pretty shortly after he got into office, and we'll get into this, but he's sort of eaten away at it in multiple ways. The August 2022 announcement of mass student loan cancellation, that was the big one, though.
In case you need a refresher, in summer 2022, President Biden promised his administration would forgive up to $20,000 in debt for any borrower who made less than $125,000 a year. If enacted, his proposal would have impacted more than 40 million Americans, but it immediately ran into roadblocks.
There was pretty immediate conservative backlash. This was viewed as really robbing the folks that never attended college, never took out loans. They just viewed it as widely unfair. So pretty shortly after, in August, conservative-led states, GOP attorneys general, they were looking at their legal options almost immediately to strike this down. And eventually they succeeded. Just a few months later, in November 2022, there was a conservative court that made an injunction against President Biden's plan, which set the ball rolling for the Supreme Court later to strike it down.
Are other politicians attempting to challenge student loan debt? Who are the folks that have rallied behind forgiveness, and who is held fast against it?
I think the Democratic Party as a whole really got behind Biden after the loan forgiveness announcement. And on the flip side, across the aisle, a lot of conservatives railed against this. They viewed this as terrible for folks who never attended college. They viewed it as, robbing taxpayers. Some of the big names we saw were Virginia Fox, who chairs, the House Education Committee and has made a point many times publicly to say that she views the Biden administration's approach as very reckless.
It feels like this has become a non-starter in Congress. Is that an accurate assessment?
I think it would be challenging. Student loan forgiveness, if it was going to go through Congress, would very much likely go through the Higher Education Act, which hasn't been rewritten for many, many years. And I think just because of the back and forth with Congress right now, the many other issues that they are dealing with, a rewrite of the Higher Education Act and college costs as a whole is just not the top priority.
Yeah, they're hardly having kumbaya moments right now in Congress.
I was going to say, they can't barely manage to pass some simple votes. I can't imagine we're going to see a wholesale rewrite of a huge education law.
All of this has been sort of moot for the last few years because many student loan payments have been on hold. Remind us what the pandemic era freeze meant and who exactly it affected.
Yeah, so this was across the board, a pandemic era freeze that was enacted in March of 2020. And I kind of chuckle because that initial payment freeze was only 60 days. And of course, we saw that it was extended many times by both administrations. But, around, I think, last year especially, some of the conservatives were really just saying that this was too much. The pandemic had wound down, for lack of a better term, and it wasn't necessary anymore to have this freeze. But at the time, it was benefiting all sorts of people. It was across the board freeze. People weren't seeing their interest accrue, which is a very key point. A lot of folks get bogged down in those high interest accruements. And so now, as we see it restarting, it's really a gut punch for a lot of folks.
After the break, wiping out student debt through executive order didn't work. So what will? Wiping out a ton of debt in one fell swoop did not work. But at the same time, the Biden administration was trying to cancel debt in a less dramatic, but arguably sneakier way. So what other moves has Biden been making on student debt?
Yeah, and I think this is confusing for a lot of folks, right? Because, we saw headlines just last week. Biden forgives $9 billion in student loan debt. So folks are sitting there going, well, what about me? This wasn't my debt. So what essentially the administration has been doing is there's, several programs that are a little bit more niche, right? They benefit certain sectors of borrowers. So there's a program that helps folks who are in government and nonprofit work. It's called Public Service Loan Forgiveness. There are students who have been defrauded by their colleges, and there's an avenue for them to get their loans wiped away. There are folks who are on income-driven payment plans. So after a certain amount of time, their balances get dropped. So all of those examples, essentially what the administration has been doing is taking a look at some of those programs and saying, how can we best use these? Because they weren't often leveraged in the correct ways. And so when you see headlines saying, Biden forgives X amount of student loan forgiveness, that's what we're looking at. It's one of these other programs that is just specific to some borrowers.
It does sound like a lot when you say $9 billion in student debt for up to 125,000 borrowers. Who's left out and how much debt still exists?
Well, it's quite a bit, right? So again, these narrow programs, they're only benefiting a certain number of people, but there's many folks who are just sort of burdened with debt, right? And it doesn't always have to be a lot, right? You look at folks who are coming right out of college or maybe going into, not a high paying job, teachers, for instance, although they can get some public service loan forgiveness. It's just really challenging for people who I think are in the most difficult financial crunch right now, that don't see a really clear path to seeing their loans forgiven.
Could you explain the mechanism he's using and how it's different from what he tried before?
Initially, in August 2022, President Biden tried to use what was called the HEROES Act to cancel student loan debt. So that was a 2003 law approved by Congress that said, during times of emergency, so in this case, a pandemic, could be war, that the education secretary has much more unilateral authority to make changes to the student loan system. So in this case, that would be loan forgiveness. And what the Supreme Court said was, no, this was, overstepping your executive authority. Now he's trying a much lengthier and I think more challenging way to go about it. And it's through this regulatory process where they gather folks from all across the higher ed industry to essentially sit down and try to hash out some policy. But this takes many, many months, right? So you have these folks meeting for, a few months. They have to agree on policy. And then the education department has to develop its own, rule that goes through months and months and months of consideration, public comment. I don't think there is any guarantee that this effort would be, done by the 2024 election, which means that, President Biden might not even be in office.
So basically, instead of forgiving a ton of debt all at once using the HEROES Act, President Biden is forgiving a little bit of debt for a few people while trying again for blanket forgiveness through these complicated committees and the Higher Education Act. Some groups might not see relief for months, if not years. Jeremy says, individually, that's not great for borrowers, and politically, that's not great for Biden.
I think it's very challenging for the administration. I don't know if I would necessarily call this a positive, right? You had a lot of folks who don't pay attention to the nuance of federal policy. And not a knock, student loans are very, very complicated. So you have folks saying, oh, well, you were going to forgive my student loans. What now? And they just kind of see nothing happening, right? There's no really firm dates coming out of the administration for good reason, because they don't know what's going to happen, whether this effort will even succeed, right? So if you have your base really clamoring, and as you said, this was an issue on the political trail, it doesn't really help the administration to say, well, we don't know, we really don't have the end goal here.
So the Biden administration's big sweeping debt cancellation, the one that was shut down by the court, was based on that reading of the HEROES Act that gave the Secretary of Education the power to waive or modify any regulatory provision to protect borrowers. And now it's using the Higher Education Act. Could you explain again what exactly that legislation does?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Higher Education Act is really the main vehicle for federal policy. So the entire really student loan system and financial aid system is actually sort of contained within it, right? So what the administration is doing now is, again, bringing all these folks from across industry to sit down, sort of do a reading of the Higher Education Act and say, what sort of authority, what sort of regulatory authority do we have under it? So the administration is considering, several different groups of borrowers when they're going through this process, such as those who have, might have taken out loans where, the current existing assistance programs, they weren't an option back then. Or, borrowers who have seen their loan balances just eclipse what they initially took out, right? So they're considering, how can we help all these different groups of struggling borrowers under this Higher Education Act, which, as I said earlier, has not seen a rewrite in quite some time.
Now, the HEROES Act was originally meant to apply to borrowers affected by terrorist attacks. And the Biden administration argued that those affected by COVID also qualify. But some lawyers didn't buy that interpretation, and neither ultimately did the Supreme Court. I wonder if his latest moves could also be legally challenged.
Absolutely. And I think that's another barrier, right? So, folks who I talked to the day that the Supreme Court struck down the initial student loan forgiveness, they were saying, if Biden tries again, he'll just run into the same problems because, regardless of how you dissect the Supreme Court decision. At its heart, it was saying that the Biden administration just didn't have authority to move forward with this mass level of student loan cancellation without congressional backing, right? And it's really the same situation here. This regulatory process doesn't touch Congress in any way. So I think we'll see similar lawsuits arise. Again, I think, the conservative dominated Supreme Court, did a little legal twisting to say that the HEROES Act didn't apply here. And, arguably what he's doing now is a weaker argument. So I could absolutely see another legal challenge.
Do you think possibly this Supreme Court could intervene again?
Yes, absolutely. I think that is the end goal by some conservatives.
Is there a possibility forgiving debt in this way, it's a very bureaucratic way, is going to leave a lot of borrowers behind?
Well, it's possible because we don't actually know what the administration is going to develop. And I think that's sort of a problem too, right? When you had this initial loan effort that was being rolled out, it was very clear cut. If you earn less than this amount, then you can see X amount wiped off your loan bill, right? Now it's sort of more nebulous. Again, how do you sum up a really complicated regulatory process in an elevator pitch for voters? It's almost impossible to do if you don't have, precise numbers. And again, for good reason, the administration hasn't released those yet because they don't know what they can accomplish. This policy is just still all being worked out.
Part of the critique is even if you wipe out debt, people are still accruing it. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because I know they've looked at these poor performing colleges, the for-profit ones. Talk a little bit more about the ongoing problem of debt.
So as you said, the administration has really prioritized targeting what they view as these, poor performing colleges, namely for-profit institutions. They're trying different policies to eliminate maybe some of the, most visible and egregious cases where students would have student loan debt. But I also think, just fundamentally, the higher ed system really needs to change, right? Costs are going to continue to skyrocket for a couple reasons. Public colleges, they are not as well funded as they once were. In a lot of cases, that means passing the tuition costs up to students. Private colleges, we've seen their sticker price rise and a lot of conversations about whether they're affordable. So, at the same time, the administration is tackling, as I said, some of these most egregious cases. There's just sort of fundamental flaws within the system that need Congress in order to change.
We know that this is an important issue for the Biden administration, even if it wasn't on the campaign trail. And this has become a big deal, and he's come at it in different ways. So I'm kind of curious if there is another path, another plan in the works, if this latest one runs into trouble that you've laid out.
I don't know. I mean, this was back to the drawing board for them. And I would have difficulty seeing another path forward if this one didn't succeed, right? And again, we're looking at this like past 2024 that loan forgiveness would actually even happen. So imagine this gets struck down by the Supreme Court. That would put Biden in the middle of another term, right? And so then you have to think, well, what other avenues does he have left that are more immediate that he can accomplish? I could see him trying again because he's made that promise to voters. But, with the legal situation the way it is, I couldn't imagine how he would succeed.
Thank you, Jeremy, for coming on What Next?
It was my pleasure.
Jeremy Bauer-Wolf is a reporter for Higher Ed Dive. That's the show. If you're a fan of What Next, the best way to support our work is to join Slate Plus. Go to slate.com/whatnextplus to sign up. What Next is produced by Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, Paige Osburn, and Madeline Ducharme. We're led by Alicia Montgomery, with a little help from Susan Matthews. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary C. Curtis, filling in for Mary Harris. Find me on Twitter. I'm at MCurtisNC3. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.
It's time to get your checking account to zero with free checking from PenFed. That's zero ATM fees, zero balance requirements, and zero time spent waiting for your paycheck to direct deposit because you can receive it up to 2 days early. Open your account with just $25 and see how big zero can be. Apply online today at PenFed.org/free checking. Early direct deposit eligibility may vary between pay periods and timing of payers' funding. To receive any advertised product, you must become a member of PenFed, insured by NCUA.